Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Tim and Hillary for another session of Dr. Tim's Aquatics podcast. And we have a very special guest and subject today, don't we, Hillary?
Yes, we absolutely do. I'm so excited. Do you want to introduce them or do you want me to introduce them?
No, you introduce them. You're the one that brought us the foundation and us together. So go for it.
I would like to introduce you guys to Dr. Greg Sinnett. He is with the Walter Munk Foundation for the Oceans, and he's joining us today because we're going to talk about some of the research that the Walter Munk Foundation for the Oceans is doing that Dr. Tim's Aquatics is going to be a part of. So, Greg, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the foundation?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Hillary. And thanks, Dr. Tim. Thank you both for having me.
Great. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm an oceanographer. I did my Ph.D. at Scripps, which is where I met Walter Munk and learned a little bit about what the Munk Foundation is doing. My study is mostly centered around physical oceanography. When people think of oceanography, they think of many different things like fish and wildlife that's living in the ocean. Biological oceanography is a core component, but I studied the physical aspects of the ocean. So things like turbulence and heat and mixing and currents and tides and those physical processes. At the Walter Munk Foundation, I'm the research director. And one of the projects that we have that we'll be talking about today on the podcast is actually in a lake, which is a little bit weird. And maybe we can talk about why we're studying the lake and sort of, those types of really interesting things. But yeah, that's what I'm here to do. The research that we're doing at the lake is part climate science and part lake study. So maybe I'll throw it back to Hillary and see what you want to talk about.
Well, let's first, real quick, Walter Munk, you may have not heard the name. If you've been out surfing, if the weather, the waves, the currents, all this stuff that we take for granted basically traces back to the pioneering research of Dr. Walter Munk at Scripps, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Thank you, Dr. Tim. Dr. Walter Munk was one of the pioneering oceanographers. Oceanography is a relatively young area of science, believe it or not. And so in the 1930s and 40s, Walter Munk started studying the ocean and made some of the pioneering wave forecasts. So surface waves that we, you go surf on or whatever. Those were really important to forecast in especially World War II, when we're doing predictions on when and where to land, for example, at D-Day. Walter Munk was instrumental in trying to figure out how surface waves can be predicted and made some of those first predictions.
Right. And even if you're not into surfing, where damage, they say the high waves in this area or flooding in this area, high tide with high waves in the moon and everything, all pioneered by Dr. Walter Munk.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting that one of his very first papers on wave prediction, he published in the journal Geology, which is, an interesting choice for an oceanographer. But he did that because the wave studies that he was looking at and the wave energy is a core component of how the coast behave, like the sedimentology and the coastal dynamics behaves as a geologist. You want to understand that. Yeah. That's why he chose to put it there.
Sorry, Hillary, go ahead.
I was going to say, Walter did so much more than just his little area that he started out in. He's got a lot of research in a lot of different areas across the board. If you talk to world leaders, even the Dalai Lama has met Walter and worked with him and helping to promote, just general goodwill.
Yeah, Walter got to start doing wave studies, but the thing that he's probably most known for is his work with ocean acoustics, sound in the ocean. And it's not intuitive that you could learn a lot about the ocean just by listening to it. But it's true. The way sound propagates through the ocean is a factor of, among other things, temperature in the ocean. So one of the things that Walter did is to put a sound source in the ocean and make a big giant beep, and then listen to it in other ocean basins far, far away, thousands and thousands of miles away. And what he was doing was looking at the total integrated temperature in that ocean basin. So as the sound propagates through the ocean, the speed of sound is a function of the temperature. He was doing one of the first studies of large-scale ocean temperature, taking basically the temperature of the ocean. And as one of the first climate scientists, it's a vitally important metric to look at, the large-scale ocean temperature.
And so let's bring this down to like where Dr. Tim's and the lake. So for you that don't know, I did 1 year studying Uppsala University limnology. Limnology is the study of freshwater biology, the physical aspects of and the biological aspects of lakes, and it was a wonderful year out on the water in Sweden. And Hillary introduced us to Greg and the Walter Munk Foundation, and it turns out that Walter grew up in Austria on a lake, right?
Yeah, that's right. This was a lake in, it's kind of the north central part of Austria, sort of up in the mountains. It's a really remote spot. And apparently he and his family used to vacation there. And so Walter had fond memories of hanging out on the shores of Lake Altaussee in Austria. And toward the end of his life, he wanted to give back to the folks in Austria and Altaussee specifically. And so he initiated a study at this lake to help the people in this very small town sort of understand their lake and learn about it and appreciate it. And what we learned is that this lake is, not only is it really well studied because of that initial effort that Walter put forward, but it's also kind of the perfect little canary in the coal mine to study a lot of other things about our climate and ocean system. So we continued studying there.
And people like to fund nice mega fauna. Everybody wants to save the whales and the pandas and stuff like that. But Dr. Tim's, we were looking for something a little more science, more basic, and wanted to do freshwater. People, of course, we all love the ocean, and when everyone here at Dr. Tim's loves the ocean, scuba dive and stuff. But you don't want to forget fresh water, because fresh water is the most important resource we have on this planet. And so it was like a perfect opportunity when Hillary put us together that we could help fund some research. And that's the subject of this podcast, is to introduce what that research is and ways that if you, the listener, want to participate, how you can do that. We've already, Dr. Tim's Aquatics has already seeded some money, and we're going to have some specials and sponsor some more things and talk this up. But we wanted Greg to introduce what that research is and the importance of studying, as he said, these lakes that are the canary in the coal mine of what's happening in our world.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Tim. The location of this lake is interesting for a few different reasons. It's situated in an alpine region, so it's relatively high, which means that it usually freezes. There's lots of snow, and it's in this perfect little zone where it's very sensitive to climate. I like to think of it like, if your freezer temperature, you set your freezer temperature below freezing so you can make ice and things in your freezer. But if that temperature rose just a few degrees, you would see a catastrophic disaster in your freezer. Your chicken would thaw and it would be really smelly, right? So this lake is right at that little cusp, right at the sensitive spot where even just a few degrees difference makes a big difference in the way the lake behaves. For the last few years, the lake hasn't frozen over, which is, it's the first time that's ever happened. There's differences in the ecology as well. The fish are decreasing in size. They're living lower in the lake. The surface of the lake is frequently warmer in summer than the bottom of the lake. That's called a thermocline. And fish that go through the thermocline, say fishermen that, bring the fish up through the thermocline, it's so hot in the surface of this lake now that the fish will die, which is kind of this really surprising thing that's happening at this lake. But we can treat this lake as an example of, many, many other lakes in both the alpine region and around the world. So it's this nice little natural laboratory to go study some of these really important climate processes that are affecting these types of regions really, really strongly.
Do we want to talk about any of the research that's been done in the past? Like, I know they've looked at like microfibers, microplastics. I know that they were looking at the big trees or the tree stumps that are just hanging out on the bottom.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. That's a good point. The study that Walter Munk initiated was first a bathymetric study. That means that they'll go and they'll map the bottom of the lake really precisely. So we know the depths, the bottom composition. They took sediment cores, so we know what's below the lake and some of the geology of the region that made the lake in the first place. So these kind of baseline studies make it possible to then do more complex and more involved studies because we already know quite a bit about the lake system. Hillary mentioned the trees. That's a really kind of interesting little, I don't know what to call it, like a little side quest. Like, yes, they're mapping the bottom of the lake. They discovered that there are some really old, really ancient tree stumps, huge trunks at the bottom of this lake. So, how did they get there? Why are they there? How have they persisted at the bottom of the lake? It's just some really interesting questions about the lake system and why things behave the way they do in this alpine region.
Do they have an idea of how old this lake is?
Well, the trees themselves are from I believe it's the 9th century. Is that correct, Hillary? They're really old.
I know they're old. I don't know if I ever heard a number.
Yeah, they're very, very old. I go look that up for you. The lake itself, in geological time is, gosh, I don't know the number, but it's thousands of years old.
Oh, so okay, I misunderstood. And then the stumps fell into the lake or rolled into the lake. They weren't growing there, and some landslide formed a dam that formed the lake, and the lake is less than younger than the tree stumps.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting question because it's unclear the origin of the tree stumps and the reason why they're at the bottom of the lake right now. That's an open question. So it very well could be that there was a large geological event that caused a landslide that brought the tree stumps down to the bottom of the lake. Could also be that there were, so there's a large groundwater source at the bottom of the lake that is one of the primary sources of water to the lake system. And changes or variations in the source of the water may be at play for, why the lake floods or why it doesn't flood. Or
lots of interesting questions. So talk a little bit about what the research that's going on in the summer. When I was in Sweden doing lake studies, we were cutting through ice because it started snowing in November and till March. For a native Southern California, that was just wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So the study that we're planning this summer and that DrTim's Aquatics has been incredibly generous to help seed will look at the temperature structure in the lake. And we'll do that by putting in a mooring, basically a clump of weights that's attached to a line that has a mooring ball on the top that will provide some flotation. And all along the line, we'll put some instruments, and the instruments will measure both oxygen and temperature at various depths. The reason why we want to do that are a few things. We want to understand the total heat content of the lake. So if you kind of well, it's a little bit more complicated than averaging, but if you look at the total volume of the lake and the average temperature at different depths, then you get a sense of the total heat content. And that matters because essentially that total amount of heat has to go away in the winter if the lake is going to freeze. So you have what's known as a heat budget for the lake. The other things that we can do with this type of study is to look at something called stratification. Stratification is basically a measure of how much energy it takes to mix the lake. If the lake is very stratified, then the surface water tends to stay at the surface and the bottom water tends to stay at the bottom. And that matters because, you know, fish that like to live at the bottom away from the heat also need oxygen. And if the lake isn't mixing very easily, then it's hard to get the oxygen at the surface down to the bottom of the lake. And you know, other processes happen as well that require some mixing. So we'll be measuring the stratification, and we'll also be measuring the amount of oxygen. So like I said, the total light content that that sources the primary productivity in the lake creates some oxygen, but things that are decaying and decomposing kind of suck up that oxygen a little bit. So we'll be measuring how much oxygen is available in the lake system, and that will relate to the ecology of the lake.
Now, this lake, lakes, you being human, we classify everything, and can be oligotrophic lakes, which are lakes without a lot of primary productivity, to eutrophic lakes that have a lot of primary productivity, which is basically photosynthesis, green organisms, you know, algae capturing light and then turning that into more algae and sucking up the nutrients. How does this lake?
Yeah, this is a eutrophic lake. So it is
a eutrophic lake
that has primary productivity. And some of the past studies actually, so Hillary alluded to some microplastic studies. There have also been some studies of the algae at the lake. And those studies are actually kind of interesting because they have been able to classify different types of algae and, you know, help those scientists point to the origins of where that algae is sourced and came from, and things that are way beyond my understanding for biology. I'm a physical oceanographer, so this is where I get off the bus. But it's pretty interesting to be able to look at the different types of algae that are sustained in this lake and how the physical system of the lake supports that primary productivity.
Right, because it's, you know, I'm on the other side, you know, the biology side. But in order to understand the biology, you have to understand the chemistry, which to do that, you really need to understand the physics, because as you said, for lakes, mixing, whether the lake mixes or doesn't mix is just primary importance, which depends a lot on like wind and snow melt, you know, salinity differences, temperature differences, and things like that. So in general, this lake becomes stratified. These are questions every year, and then mixes as the water cools. That hot surface water eventually starts to cool, and the lake will turn over and mix. But if it didn't, and has it ever had long periods where it didn't mix?
Yeah, this is a really good question, Dr. Tim. So when you say turnover, what you're talking about is lakes do this really cool thing where the density of water is maximum at about 4 degrees C, which is just above freezing. So which
is why ice cubes float.
That's right. It's why ice cubes float, because they're solid, right? And so they're actually less dense than the water that they're floating in. But you don't even need to make ice to, well, let's put it this way. if you're going to cool the lake, right, the surface of the water is where it's getting cool, right? So if you imagine fall, the air is getting cooler, it's windy, the surface is cooling down and cooling down. And as you do, and you get cooler and cooler water, that water is more dense than the warmer water beneath it. And so the surface will kind of sink down to the bottom of the lake as it cools. And that's what happens when the lake turns over. And so this is the fall mixing of the lake. What then happens is that the surface gets to about 4 degrees C, and it's as dense as it will possibly be, and then it will cool a little bit more. And because it cools a little bit more, it's actually less dense than that maximum 4 degrees C point. And so that cool water will float and form ice on the surface. And so at that point, the lake has completely turned over and completely mixed and formed ice. What's happened in the past 3 years is that the lake hasn't actually cooled down to that 4 degrees C point. And so it hasn't formed ice. It's been mixing, but to what extent it's mixed and to what depth it's mixed are open questions that we're going to explore with this study.
How high is this lake? What's the elevation?
It's at about 2,700 feet.
Okay.
Which is a relatively low alpine lake. So, many alpine regions are much higher, and it's as if you had set your freezer points at, incredibly low. So yes, it will absolutely freeze in winter if you're at really, really high elevations. This particular lake is lower so that, it still is, there's snow and there's ice and, all of those things, but it's low enough that it's at a point that's right close to that kind of critical point where water will freeze or not freeze.
Yeah. So it's in a zone where there's lots of potential for changes. It can go either way.
That's right. It's really sensitive to different changes.
Which makes the science interesting, because if nothing changed, you wouldn't be able to study it very well.
That's right. This is a perfect kind of natural laboratory for both lake studies. And our name is the Walter Munk Foundation for the Oceans. And so we're also concerned about the ocean. These processes also happen in the ocean, but they happen a little differently. So using this as a natural laboratory to kind of strip away some of the more complicated ocean processes and look at climate processes from an air-sea, like the atmospheric effect on a body of water, is a really, really great kind of natural laboratory that we're able to do here at the lake.
So we funded one mooring, I think.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, if people are interested in Hillary will be posting ways, because the Walter Munk Foundation is a 501(c) scientific foundation, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, we're a nonprofit.
Right.
Yep.
And part of this is to get the word out and help fund this, and all the donations, they go right to Walter Munk Foundation. There'll be links to that. It's nothing Dr. Timms has contributed, but there's ways people can help with the study, because there are more moorings and there's different things that you want to do, and there's a whole group of scientists from Europe that and other parts that are going to be studying the lake over the summertime, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So Dr. Timms Aquatics has been incredibly generous and donated an entire mooring. The cost of one mooring ranges depending on the amount of instruments that we're going to put on. The one that Dr. Timms Aquatics has sponsored will look at the entire vertical temperature structure in the center of the lake, which is incredibly valuable. Other moorings will look at temperature at each end of the lake and oxygen at the very bottom of the lake. So these are different moorings in different locations. The reason to do this is to be able to tell something about the spatial structure of temperature. The more we sample the lake, the more we understand it, obviously. And there are some lake processes that create variability or differences in temperature depending on where you measure. Some of those processes we know about, and by choosing the location of where we put these moorings really intentionally, we'll be able to tell something about those processes as well.
And so if people are interested, there'll be a link, and Hillary will have this up where, I mean, any contribution helps, but clubs can get together, groups can get together and help fund this very basic and important climate research. We have to understand the physical environment, because that, as I said, affects the chemical, which infects the biological. It's all interconnected.
Yeah, that's right. So this project is one aspect of research at Lake Altaussee. So if people are interested in participating in this study, they'll be able to kind of follow along with the science that we're doing, and they'll be supporting both the ongoing study at this lake, but also participating in the Austrian strategy for climate change. So this is a component of that, and it's supported by the Austrian Federal Agency for Water Management. So these studies that we're doing here are part of the European Union's commitment to climate study and the Austrian commitment to water management and adaptation to climate change. For folks that want to participate and donate, the experiment.com page that we've set up is probably the best place to do that. And it's also a place where we'll be posting updates and results and, some fun interactive things that like you can participate with us in this science.
Right. And Hillary, in our podcast, as we go on, we'll be talking about this and doing some special events to show people what the research is and what the results are and what's going on in real time. Because once you get out on the water, things happen, which makes it fun and exciting.
We're counting on it.
And you learn about things like trees at the bottom of the lake. Why are they
Yeah,
there?
exactly. Yeah, happy little accidents that you want to learn more about.
Yes.
And this isn't, so we've talked about the research that's been done in the past, what we're going to be doing this year, but this year doesn't end the research. There's more in the future. Like this is a long-term study. Am I correct?
That's right, Hillary. This is the first of what we hope to be an observatory, basically, at this lake. In order to study climate and climate effects on Earth systems, you need a long-term record. So, if you want to study something that's happening quickly, you can observe it for a short amount of time. But if you want to study something that happens over a long period of time, you need long, sustained observations. And in climate or in earth science, those are pretty hard to do. They're often expensive. They're often labor intensive. And we're pretty fortunate here at Lake Altaussee that we have some European partners. We have, through the Walter Munk Foundation, we have some, scientists that are committed to the project. And so we'll be able to do this not only for this year, but to kind of seed this project along and keep it providing observational data for a long time.
Right, because the equipment doesn't go away. Once you buy, maybe it has to be serviced and things like that, but it can be used again and again.
That's right. The equipment that DrTim's Aquatics has sponsored, as well as equipment that's we'll be able to purchase through any fundraising efforts that we're able to do. That's equipment that can last decades, right? We just need to take care of it, but it will be in the water almost continuously, and then serviced by both us and our European partners at Boku University and some others that participate in this year round.
Yeah, so it's not a one-time donation. It's that's what we're looking for, is to do more and more to understand these. And Dr. Tim's works on we make freshwater products, we make saltwater products, and this kind of brings me back to that studying limnology, which was always just a great interest and a lot of fun, those formative years when you're getting really into the science more seriously.
I should mention too that Austria is a landlocked country and they import 95% of their seafood, but the 5% that they don't import is from the lakes, throughout Austria. So this sort of science in lakes with limnology is, it's interesting, it's important, and it's fundamental to economies. Not only just kind of, what's happening and why do we want to know it, but it's really important to a lot of different, folks both in Austria and elsewhere.
Right. What a lot of people take fresh water for granted, but as Dr. Tim's is out here based in California. In the last 3 or 4 years, we didn't have any water. In the last 6 months, we've got too much water. And going forward, as we get into spring and the record snow melt, there's going to be lots of issues. But there's the fresh water. That's why we build dams in reservoirs. It's a limited supply, and it causes lots of problems. It gets into politics. The reservoirs, Lake Mead, Lake Havasu, are at the lowest levels ever. Is fed by the Colorado River, which gets water from snowmelt. Look at what's happening with the Great Salt Lake in Utah. It has evaporated to its lowest levels ever. And in all parts of the world, we take fresh water for granted, but we tend to pollute it and not conserve it very well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You raise an interesting point that a lot of the lakes that you mentioned have some man-made controls associated with them, either dams or other other apparatus that can help control the lake. But if you're going to control the lake and you're going to put some management behind how these lakes are operated or functioning, you really need to understand the natural physical systems that are happening in and to the lake before you try to regulate it or control it. It's more likely to be effective if you understand the natural systems first.
Right. Understand before you dam or something like that. Now,
Right.
You mentioned earlier, well, made that up. You mentioned earlier that there's a subterranean water flow into this lake, which is not all that common. Most lakes get the majority of their water from the watershed, and you take a more holistic approach in that all that water, all that snow is on the land and it's flowing into the lake, which is bringing in nutrients and things like that. But this lake has a subterranean spring. How much of the water budget do you know how much that accounts for?
We don't know exactly, but we know that it's significant. So there's a river that runs into the lake and there's a river that runs out of the lake. That's a pretty typical system for lakes. And that's the surface water runoff that you were mentioning. The groundwater is from this spring pit that is, it's not quite in the middle, but it's a really deep pit. And we can tell based on the rivers are gauged. So we have an estimate of the amount of water running into the lake and the amount of water running out of the lake. We can estimate the amount of water that's evaporating or precipitation that's entering the lake. And what's left over is from the groundwater. And we know that the groundwater discharge must be a significant component of the lake budget. But exactly how much, and if that groundwater source is variable, so say in springtime maybe it's really large, or in summertime maybe it's not, and even where that groundwater source is coming from, those are all sort of open questions that this heat budget study may help to answer. It's one of those sort of open questions that this study isn't intentionally designed to find out, but the instruments that we're putting on to these mooring lines and the location of these moorings are intentional enough so that we can try to pick apart at that question, because it is an important question. What is the source of water to this lake? That's a pretty fundamental thing.
Right. And so we really do appreciate you taking time. And to kind of wrap up a little bit, these are important. Why are these important to hobbyists? And if especially this, as you said, the work and the study you're doing can be applied to the ocean. The ocean is much larger, so salinity and much more complicated. But also freshwater in itself. Freshwater fish are important. They count a lot, not only economically, recreationally, but they tell us what's going on. They literally can be that canary that shows us that maybe that we're doing the wrong things, or the people talk about climate change, but if a lake's been freezing for years and years and decades and centuries and then stops freezing, what changes are going to happen? And then what's happening as the world gets warmer, and that's going to affect us, because that will result in more evaporation. That can change fish populations. It can have major effects that we don't really know that well right now.
Yeah, that's true. As as a hobbyist, I would imagine that what is in an aquarium is sort of a sample, if you will, of a lake environment or an ocean environment. You mimic basically what's in nature, and make it interesting and exciting and whatever in your aquarium. But if something were to happen inside your aquarium and your fish were living in a different spot in the aquarium, let's say, or they just weren't eating, or they were not healthy, then as a hobbyist, I suppose you would want to take steps to find out what was going on in the aquarium. Right. Maybe taking some chemical analysis, or making sure that your thermometer was calibrated correctly, or whatever it is. We're doing the same here in the lake. It's very analogous. We've observed drastic changes in the lake, both in the biology and in the physical aspects of the lake, and so we're trying to figure out why. And we're doing this in an intentional and scientific way, so that we can document both the changes and the causes. Almost as a hobbyist, what I would imagine.
Right. Well, I remember, and Hillary, I don't know if you were in the marine hobby at this time, but it used to have all these metal halides. That was the lights, because that people used over their aquariums, and they generated so much heat that you had to have a chiller unit on your tank, because you were warming the tank, the aquarium water up so much that the corals couldn't survive. So you had to have the light for the corals, but then the downside was you were generating so much heat that you had to put a chiller unit on there. So you're kind of chasing your tail, and that's why the physical aspects of oceanography or limnology are just critical, because if water gets too warm, you're not going to be able to, the fish won't survive. When the fish don't survive, then you have changes in zooplankton, then you have changes in the phytoplankton. The whole system starts to crash, as we're seeing with warmer ocean temperatures and coral reefs and things like that. The fauna and flora is not adapted to these higher temperatures.
Exactly.
So, Well, Dr. Kennett, we're very happy that you could join us today and discuss the Walter Munk Foundation. Hillary will put it, I mean, it's waltermonkfoundation.org. Is that I should know that.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we'll have all the links below in the
Right,
video
we'll have
description.
all the links. But there's lots of cool stuff that they're doing, both freshwater, limnology, and then oceanography. And we're really excited to be partnering and help supporting this research. We're going to talk about it more and more. And we'll have you and maybe some other scientists in here as the project gets started. And Hillary will have lots of ways that if you're interested in helping out, it's fun and exciting to learn this, and part of the aspect of just keeping fish in aquariums, I think.
We're thrilled to have you as partners in this project, and we're really thankful for your support, and are really excited to engage both you and their followers and everyone in this project. It's really interesting science, so we're thrilled to be able to do it.
Yeah. So if you're interested in this type, well, you should be interested in this research. Not if you should, just be interested, because it's critical, and you can know what you might learn and get out there in the world. Put the computer down and get outside a little bit, and it's just a lot of fun. So,
Yes.
Any closing words, Hillary?
I'm going to shout out a couple of things. And again, I'll have these in the show notes. If you want to donate to this project, you can go to experiment.com and in the search button, type in Walter Munk Foundation. And the project that we are raising funds for is called Establishing a Baseline Climate Science to Support Sensitive Alpine Lake Ecology Management. So that's the project that you're looking for. If you are interested in following along on the social media, obviously at DrTim's Aquatics on Instagram, or if you want to follow the Walter Munk Foundation, we'll have this information both places, but at Walter Munk Foundation on Instagram as well.
Great. Once again, thanks for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it, and I definitely know we'll have you back again to update us as the summer progresses.
I'm really excited for that. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. This has been Dr. Tim and Hillary for another Dr. Tim's Aquatics podcast. Good fish keeping.